This is what it looks like when 300 tons of petrol explodes at once. This is Buncefield, likely the UK's largest explosion since World War II, and a fascinating story of bad engineering and bad luck. Oil depots catch fire quite often, but rarely on this scale. So what made this such a big bang? We have a global energy system, which means we have to extract, refine, transport and store oil all across the globe. And inevitably, whenever we have a lot of fuel in one place, there's always going to be the chance that it goes bang. But none of those explosions were quite on the scale of what we saw at Buncefield. If we take it minute by minute, we can uncover a story both of shit luck and shit engineering that led to quite such a big bang. Our story starts here, at Buncefield in southeast England. It's in the deeply misunderstood town of Hemel Hempstead, which turned out to be one of God's favourites because even Europe's biggest peacetime explosion couldn't destroy it. Buncefield was one of the biggest oil depots in the country, set up as a joint venture between Total and Chevron, two companies that have never done anything bad ever. I want to take you back to the night of Saturday, the 10th of December, 2005. It's a cold, still night and the air is humid. There's almost no wind. This is going to be important later. Right now it's important because I can't feel my hands. In the control room at Buncefield, someone receives a message. They're about to get a big delivery of oil through one of their pipelines. There's more than can fit in one tank, which means we're going to have to switch tanks halfway through the filling operation. I'm sure this won't be a big plot point later. So tank 912 begins receiving its petrol. And there are three main ways that our friends in the control room can tell just how much petrol is in that tank and stop it from overfilling, which would of course be really bad, so we'll make sure will never happen under any circumstances. The first one is called stock tracking, and this is basically just accounting. If we know how much fuel is in the tank to start with, and we know how quickly fuel is coming into the tank, then we can work out reasonably well when the tank is going to be full. However, this wasn't that simple on the night. Now, this pipeline coming into Buncefield was controlled not actually at Buncefield, but way up the pipe at somewhere called Kingsbury. Now, the upshot of this was that Kingsbury was on a completely different system, which meant that they could see how much fuel was coming through the tank and they could control filling operations, but the people where the tank actually was, down at Buncefield, had no idea what the flow rate was and they can't easily control the tank. In fact, to stop the flow, they had to make a phone call to the guys at Kingsbury. On top of this, Buncefield working conditions were tough, especially leading up to the incident. Around this time, it wasn't unknown for supervisors to regularly work 84-hour weeks, actively blocking the hiring of new supervisors at Buncefield to make sure they got that sweet overtime pay, which is pretty crazy that that's even allowed to happen. And the amount of oil coming through Buncefield was quite a lot higher than it was originally designed for back when it was started up. This meant that on any given time, supervisors are probably dealing with several filling and unfilling operations, as well as fuel tankers and whatever else is going to come up. And evidence for just how stressful this was can be seen in the fact that the Buncefield operations manager, who's one of the most senior figures at the site, had offered his resignation just a few days before Buncefield incident happened, citing just how stressful these working conditions were. So the fact that the site was understaffed and those staff were overworked, as well as the fact that loads of things were happening at once and that they couldn't really access much information or almost any control over this pipeline, meant that realistically stock tracking was unlikely to work as a form of overfill protection on the night. That means the first one of our three is already gone. So tank 912 continues receiving its petrol, filling up through the night. Now we get to about 3:15 a.m. the next morning, and this is where our second form of overfill protection starts to become important. That's the automatic gauging system, or ATGS, because everything needs to be an acronym in engineering. Now this is just a gauge that tells us how much fuel is in the tank, and the thing we're going to rely on to tell us how much space we've got. It can be seen from the control room, we can set little alarms to tell us exactly when we've hit certain levels. It's all very nice, and it's definitely going to stop anything going wrong. Except it doesn't, and it hasn't worked for months. Since it'd been replaced about 4 months before in August, the gauge had got stuck at least 14 times, and it got to the point where it was such a sort of routine thing. Operators had worked out little ways to kind of fill the oil up more and more to unstick it, or to have silly workarounds using things like alarm clocks and stuff. They'd essentially just given up on relying on this gauge, which is supposed to be the main way you can tell how much oil is in the tank. Inevitably, on this night, it gets stuck again. In the control room, instead of seeing a nice gauge filling up gently as more oil comes into tank 912, instead they just see a gauge flatlining. If the control room had been better designed, we might have seen this as a problem and stopped anything bad happening down the road. Instead it wasn't. The control room was also shittily designed. So that control room kept track of 4 main tanks, and all of those tanks were monitored on the same computer monitor. So when you've got several tanks filling up at once, you can only have a look at one at one time. You have to flick between them to keep an eye on all of them. At this point in the night, there are other tanks doing other things. Tank 912 is not the only thing on the supervisor's mind. As a result, the flatlining gauge just isn't noticed at all. If the control room was better designed, they might have seen it there and then. Not that it would have been particularly useful, because around this point in the night, the supervisor actually left the control room to go deal with a problem with tankers down the road. We get to around 4 AM on Sunday morning. By now, we should have triggered our third and final form of overfilling protection. This is the independent high-level switch, or, sorry, more acronyms, IHLS. Because again, the rules are the rules. The rules are the rules. Now this works when oil reaches a certain level, it pushes on the bottom here and activates a switch. This switch just set off an alarm and stop oil filling into the tanker. This is an absolute last resort way to make sure that overfilling cannot happen under any circumstances. If our other 2 methods fail, then at least we have this absolute fail-safe switch that should trigger in any situation. Of course, it doesn't trigger. Take a look at this lever. It's used to test the system and make sure that the alarm or the cutoff is working without having to actually fill the tank full of oil. We can just push that lever, check that the switch does what it should do, and get on with our day. Now, the important thing to know about this lever is that it means that the whole system won't work unless we keep it in a special position using this padlock here on the other side. Essentially, if this padlock isn't installed in the exact right place on the system, then we're cooked. The whole system won't work at all. So let me just reiterate that. If we don't put a padlock on this safety system, this absolute last resort failsafe, if there's no padlock in this one place, put in the right hole, it won't work at all. That's it. Which is crazy. That is crazy. This padlock was completely critical to how the switch worked, yet the supervisors weren't told anything about it. They figured it was probably just a safety feature, and this is a switch that's inside a tank, that's inside a high safety enclosure. Like, there's not a big deal about putting a padlock on it. It's not a big safety risk as far as they were concerned. So they never bothered with the padlock. The padlock didn't go on, and the switch never worked. As a result, the tank just kept receiving more oil, and we're getting to the point now where we're almost spilling over the top. Eventually, of course, 912 begins to overfill. This happens at 5:35 in the morning on Sunday, the 11th of December. Hundreds of tons of petrol will get spilled over the side. And an interesting but maybe overlooked part of Buncefield's perfect storm is how that petrol spills out. This is actually really important. Now, you may well know that petrol just by itself as a liquid is actually not that easy to set on fire. When we put it in a car engine, you spray it as a really fine mist to make sure that it mixes with air well. And at that point, where you have both fuel and oxygen in the same place, then it burns really well. At Buncefield, the petrol's coming out of the tank right from the top, out of these roof vents, which means that it's falling with quite a lot of speed because there's quite a long way to go, meaning that the flow gets broken up into tiny droplets which vaporize easily and are held in that vapor. The upshot of all of this is that we have 2 things. Firstly, a big vapor cloud. Lots of petrol that is turned into a gas that is then floating away gently from tank 912. And making the situation worse, we also have an aerosol. This is petrol that stayed as a liquid, but has been broken up into such small droplets that those droplets aren't affected as much by gravity and can float along with the cloud. This means that that cloud is extremely flammable, and when it does go up, it has a lot of energy in a small space.
Coming down here, drive down in 3 Cherry Trees Lane where I thought I'd drive into some fog, and so severe fog I couldn't see, so I had to come to a stop. The car started to rev on its own without any inputs from myself. In fact, I even turned the engine off by the key, and it was still running. It was all trying to go through my mind what the problem was. There was this very heavy mist hanging in the air, and then I was aware of a very strong smell which felt quite solventy, and that was telling me that perhaps it wasn't a problem in my car, but there was a problem outside. There was something that had leaked here.
Now, I said earlier that weather conditions on the night of the incident would be important, and I wasn't lying. Let me remind you, the air on the morning of Sunday the 11th of December 2005 was kind of like me at a school swimming lesson. It's cold, it's wet, and it's not moving. This means two important things for our situation in Tank 912 at Buncefield. First thing is, of course, with no wind, there's nothing to disperse this vapour cloud that's building up around the tank, so it just keeps gradually creeping out, growing and growing. The other important consequence of this cold, wet air means that as the vapour is forming, right, as this petrol is turning from a liquid into a gas, it sucks energy out of the air as heat. It's getting colder and forming ice crystals that form this big ice mist that follows wherever this vapour cloud of petrol goes. You can actually see this ice cloud being formed as it slowly creeps away from Tank 912, clinging to the vapour cloud. It's all over the CCTV footage of the night. At this point, the flow rate is actually increased to almost double what it was before. By 6 o'clock, almost 300 metric tons of petrol have spilled out of Tank 912 at Buncefield. This has all created a giant cloud of vapour, which is spread out not just through the Buncefield Park, but an industrial estate next to it, car parks and lanes around it. And it could go up at any second.
Emergency.
Hello, call the fire engines, please.
What's wrong?
It's on Maylands Avenue. There's been an explosion. I live on Mason's Road, and it's at the house that I'm according to.
Okay, it's one of the houses, is it?
I don't know if it's a house or if it's a building. But
Okay,
it's
we're on up.
It's a big explosion.
Hello, I'm sure you've had lots of calls about this already, but I'm phoning to say that there's been an explosion on Woodall Farm.
Yeah, do you know what it is?
No, it's blown, we live about 2 streets away and it's blown all our windows out.
Right,
It's the
okay.
most terrific explosion I've ever seen, and I can still see a ball of fire.
The first and largest of the series of explosions hits Buncefield at 6:01 on Sunday morning. It measures 2.4 on the Richter scale. Now, we don't actually know for certain what the source of ignition was, but it seems, on the balance of probability, that it was probably a spark from a fire alarm, ironically, in the pump house near the tank. However, to understand why this was quite such a big bang, we need to know more than there was a big vapour cloud. There are other elements here that are fascinating and tell us quite why this went so bigly. So how do we go from being a flame to being an explosion? It's all about adding turbulence. In the case of Buncefield, what added turbulence to the flame was its surroundings. Trees, other buildings, other tanks, things like that, all stopped the flame as it travelled outwards, which meant it had to kind of flow past them. As it flowed past them, it gets churned up, introducing turbulence to the flame front. And we can actually demonstrate this using some pretty advanced scientific equipment. It's squash. It's squash. It's apple and blackcurrant squash. I prefer lemon, but you do what you can. Imagine first we have a flame front moving unobstructed through the air. Obviously there's still some mixing that you can see as the squash slows down into the water, but it's not as much as if we introduced an obstacle. Let's have a look at a second case. Our comb here is maybe representing trees or other obstacles that the flame would face as it rushed away from the tank. As we release the flame into the obstacles around it, you can see it mixing and interacting with them, introducing way more turbulence. This process, mixing up the fuel and oil and adding energy to the front of the flame, is exactly what happened at Buncefield to make it such a violent explosion. Miraculously, even though it was such a big blast, no one was killed. This was literally just because it was on a Sunday morning when no one was there. If it happened even 24 hours later, the next Monday, there would have been people on the nearby M1 motorway, in the industrial site next door, and of course on the Buncefield site itself. It's probably not unfair to say tens or maybe even over 100 people would have been killed. So the fact that no one died in this explosion is incredible. The main operator of the site, Total, was found criminally guilty for the event and charged a whopping 360 million no, I'm lying. 36 mi... No, I'm still lying. That's still psych. £3.6 million in fines for causing about £1 billion worth of damages. And that was in 2005 money. That's when the pound still was worth something. You'll be pleased to know that the two companies that created the broken gauge and the high-level switch that needed a padlock to work were fined a whopping £1,000 each, which was understandably met with quite a lot of anger by the people who'd had their businesses destroyed by their shitty engineering. But while they're interesting, this video and this channel, we're not trying to focus on the economic impacts and the court cases that followed. We want to focus on the engineering. So I think it's worth wrapping up and looking back and answering in a concrete way what were the main causes for this crazy explosion. So first up, there are human factors, and of course this is part of pretty much any disaster that ever happens. Part of the problem, at least, is the humans. And in this case, of course, they knew about the faulty tank gauge, which was never properly fixed, and the quirks with the high-level switch were never properly communicated to the supervisors that actually had to use them. More generally, there were obviously managerial problems at the site. I mean, people were working 84-hour weeks. That should never happen. And the site was being worked harder than it arguably should have been, certainly with that level of staffing. This all created a big part of this perfect storm. Undeniably, though, there was, of course, some shit engineering and really bad design at play. Of course, there was the broken tank gauge that was never properly addressed or fixed. Most obviously, there was the high-level switch that was just horribly designed. I know I've said it before, but come on, the whole safety hinges on one padlock you're not going to tell anyone about? That's poor form. More generally, some papers have argued that we should have learnt lessons from other similar incidents in the past. This is not the first time petrol storage or refinery has led to a vapor cloud explosion. In fact, it's a pretty common event that there are several precedents for that are eerily similar to Buncefield in a lot of ways. Maybe it's easy to say now, maybe hindsight's 2020, but some people have argued that we should have seen this coming way, way before it did. I'm interested to know you guys' opinions. Finally, of course, Buncefield, as any of these disasters are, is a story of bad luck. And also good luck. Of course, we have bad luck with the weather. If it wasn't so humid, it wasn't so dry and still. I just said humid and dry, that's crazy. If it wasn't so cold and it wasn't so still, the vapor cloud would not have sat on the ground in the way that it did, waiting to explode. Equally, it's very unlikely that the vapor cloud would be there for half an hour before anything sets it off. In similar explosions that we've seen before, usually a cloud is building up for 2 or 3, up to about 5 minutes before there's an ignition. Of course, there was one stroke of immense good luck here, and that was the timing. For it to go on the Sunday morning when almost no one was around is very, very lucky. As we said, if it happened 24 hours later, tens of people would probably have been killed. So what can we say about this? Well, Buncefield's been pretty heavily studied, which gave me some great sources to draw on for this video. In fact, a big part of why I chose this to talk about is because there's some brilliant analysis looking at exactly what made this such a powerful explosion. I'd love to know what you guys think was the main reason. Is there one glaring thing that I haven't talked about? There's plenty that I've had to leave out for the sake of brevity, that's always the case. Let me know if there's another disaster or another shit bit of engineering you'd like me to cover. It's always interesting kind of pulling back the hood, ignoring the sensationalism for a second and looking at actually why things happen. So I hope that's given you a bit of insight in that one. Let me know something you'd like me to cover in a bit. Please do subscribe if you like this kind of thing. Drop us a like. I can't remember the other things because we just love the videos. See you in a bit. Love you. Bye.